there's some other limitations that I wanted to note in terms of what the council can do and what the council can't do in the charter and in the municipal code. So the council can inquire into certain things, like administrative matters under the city manager, and the council can instruct the manager in all manners of policy, but the council can't attempt to influence or direct any subordinates of the manager, and that would include the chief of police or anyone in the police department as it's relevant to this discussion. There's a court decision from about 17 years ago out of Santa Monica. It involved, I believe, the planning department, but what that sort of means for here is that Santa Monica had a charter provision similar to what we have in Pasadena, what a number of other charter cities have, and it allowed the council to inquire, but that was it. And so it prohibited orders, for example, from the council or an individual council member asking, for example, the planning director, what's the status of this project? That's okay to inquire, but to tell the planning director, you should do this or you should do X on this project, that's instructing staff subordinate to the manager. So what was going on in Santa Monica with a council member was just making inquiry, and the court found that to be within the matter of inquiry, like what Pasadena has within its charter. So this is another sort of set of provisions in I believe it's in the charter, and talking about how the city manager essentially is responsible for administrative service, for supervision and control over all departments, divisions, and offices in the city. The police department is one of those that's under the city manager's responsibility. So, the next couple of slides, police department is going to talk about what they do as far as detective section looking into officer-involved shootings, and then also professional standards unit with their administrative review of shootings. And before I turn it over to Lieutenant Gordon, I'll turn it over to Chief Perez for some brief remarks.
Thank you so much, and I'll be very brief. I just wanted to ensure that people understood the structure of administrative investigations. And as a chief of police, I am responsible for all admin investigations internally. The structure of admin investigations is that they are investigated by our administrative section. The administrative section is overseen by our Deputy Chief Cheryl Mood, who couldn't be here today, but it's also managed by a lieutenant in Carolyn Gordon, who just arrived to that section from our homicide division. So she is learning quick and fast, and she will cover some of the points, and we will fill in the gaps as needed. Thank you.
And I am going to ask before Lieutenant Gordon starts your presentation. I'd like to give Lieutenant Gordon an opportunity to complete her presentation before we have any questions from members of the committee. So if you can, I'm making notes as we go through the presentation, and I would ask the members of the committee give the lieutenant an opportunity to complete her presentation, and then we can. Lieutenant?
Hello, how is everyone today? I just want you to know that I'll be speaking generally about what happens when it comes to officer-involved shootings and in-custody deaths. So what will happen is that the detective lieutenant will get a call from either a commander or the watch commander notifying them of a critical incident. And then that lieutenant will contact his team, which would be a sergeant and approximately 4 detectives. Those 4 detectives, along with the sergeant and the lieutenant, will respond to the scene. When they respond to the scene, they will first get a briefing as to what happened, and they'll get the facts. And they'll ask questions. And some of the questions that they'll ask, specifically in an officer-involved shooting, is they will ask, how many rounds did the officer fire? In what direction? And those things are very, very important. Asking where, if there's a suspect that's outstanding, if there's a vehicle that's outstanding, making sure that that description gets out to the other police officers. So we'll get those facts. And I just want to say that when we ask the question of how many rounds were fired, we have to make sure that there are no additional victims. And so we're going to check that as detectives. And so the detectives will go in, they'll conduct an investigation, which means that they'll also look at all the evidence that's present that they can, and they will probably instruct the forensic specialist to collect evidence. Their other job is to canvass for witnesses. So they'll canvass the areas if there's witnesses. They'll canvass the areas for cameras. They'll canvass the area for any type of video, anything that's necessary for the investigation. When the officers are done there, they normally will go back to the station and they'll look at the officer's body-worn camera. They'll look at the map. And it takes some time, but these are just some of the things that the detectives have to do. Sometimes they go back out and re-interview witnesses. And one of the things that the sergeant does immediately is that he notifies the DA command post. And then a DA responds to the scene as well, and they also get a brief. When the detectives are finished with their investigation, their case is submitted to the district attorney's office, and we wait a response from the prosecutor's office. They review it, and then they give us an answer as to what they find. And then that will go to the next slide, and we'll talk about the administrative process. The administrative process, what will happen is first we will get a call, and I shouldn't say we, I will get a call either from Deputy Chief Moody or a commander to say we had an officer-involved shooting. It will probably be myself and two sergeants that respond to the scene. Now, at that time, we don't get involved in the investigation. We look at things from a policy perspective and for procedures. And that can include tactics and that can include training. So at that time, we get the brief. The detectives are doing their job. We kind of look at the scene. We make notes. And then we go back to our office and we wait for the investigation to be completed. Once the investigation is completed and the DA's office has reviewed it, then it comes to our office and we will review it as well. And so we will look to see if there's any additional investigation that we need to do or if there's any witnesses that we need to speak to. So there's a couple things that occur. In an investigation involving officers, when it's an officer-involved shooting, officers can give what we call a voluntary statement. If they give a voluntary statement, we may not have to go in and ask them any questions. If they don't give a voluntary statement, then in our administrative review, we will request for them to come in and for them to give a mandatory statement, a compelled statement they'll have to give to our investigators. When they give that statement cannot be used in the criminal investigation. It can only be used in the administrative process. When we have completed our investigation, we then do a presentation to command staff with all the facts that we found. If there's some additional information that we've uncovered, we do a presentation, and then the chief will render as to if there's any discipline or if this was just within policy. Thank you.
And members of the committee on that background in terms of what CPD does with their administrative review and their criminal investigation that then goes to the district attorney's office. One area of law that's important to note here is what's called the Public Safety Officers Procedural Bill of Rights, or Peace Officers Bill of Rights, or also what's known as POBAR. And basically the department, all other things being equal, they need to notify, if they're going to discipline the officer, they need to inform the officer of that discipline within 1 year of discovering the incident. However, there's some circumstances that state law allows for what's called tolling or extending of the limitation period to impose discipline. And a couple common reasons to toll the limitation period are, first off, if the either detectives or district attorney is still looking into the officer's actions, or if there's civil litigation involving the incident and the officer is a defendant in that civil litigation. With criminal investigations on officer-involved shootings, oftentimes in recent years, the district attorney has taken not just months, but sometimes years to reach a conclusion on whether charges might be filed, and civil litigation can often take some time. So oftentimes when these two circumstances come into play, it may be a while before the department does actually reach a conclusion on whether the officer acted within policy or whether they did not act within policy and what the discipline might be. So one question that might be asked is, with all this understanding of what the department does and sort of where the city's charter sits, what can the council's role be in terms of imposing a deadline on Pasadena PD to complete their administrative reviews, whether it be whatever fixed time period? And we believe that the charter, as it expresses the council manager form of government, it prevents that type of a policy because it involves personnel matters under the administrative service of the city manager, because the manager hires the chief hires employees within the police department. And so for the council to direct the timing of how the chief might conduct an administrative review, we believe that would interfere with the charter. Now, with that being said, we believe the council still could play a role if they may wish to suggest to the city manager certain policies or certain changes in policy in that regard. With that being said, I think particularly with officer-involved shooting, I think there's some competing factors and also some considerations that really would suggest that it may be best to leave things to the chief to deal with things on a case-by-case basis. And just one example of where the department may wish to complete the administrative review within, perhaps quickly. If they do that, then they cannot access information from, for example, the district attorney's office when the district attorney's office either clears the officer and issues a detailed letter with findings and reasons for that, or if the district attorney's office charges the officer. Again, the department cannot access that information if they act quickly. But in certain circumstances, if there's sufficient assurance to the department that the officer seriously committed a very serious violation of policy, the department might choose to act quickly. And I think one example, even just this month, is the Long Beach School District terminated an officer about a week and a half after a shooting. I'm not aware of any criminal charges that were filed or any civil litigation that was filed. But again, based on that incident with Long Beach Unified School District, they believed that was sufficient enough to terminate the officer. But again, that tends to be practically the exception and not the rule. A few reasons why the department might wish to defer completing the administrative review is, first off, they can benefit from the district attorney's investigation. It's not just the write-up, but any additional evidence that might be developed, and then they would be so informed. Also, waiting till the end of civil litigation, the correctional standards unit might be informed, the officer might testify in deposition, the officer might testify at trial. Those are additional pieces of evidence, and the professional standards units can look to see whether whether that testimony is consistent with the officer's voluntary statement, with whether it's consistent with his compelled statement, with other pieces of evidence. And finally, I'd point out that if the department were to complete an administrative review before litigation were concluded, there could be significant adverse effects on the city's legal position, which also can be a consideration in some circumstances. So, Mayor, I think with that background, that concludes the presentation, and Lieutenant Gordon and I are available for questions.
Let me just ask a couple of opening questions, and I'll turn to my colleagues. If you can reconcile for me the charter provision on page 2 of the presentation. You clearly state that the city council instructs the city manager on policies, typically policies. But then on page 8, you cover that the council could suggest policy changes to policy. Because you said that city attorney does not believe that we can direct the city manager, but we can suggest policy changes as a council, whether the manager under that scenario chooses to give effect to a suggestion of the city council. It's a different question, but how do you reconcile the page 2 language that the council instructs the city manager on policies with page 8
overarching factor here is that this particular matter that we're discussing involves the administrative review of an officer-involved shooting, which could result in discipline. That's a personnel matter. The charter actually speaks to that, to the specific point of personnel matters should be dealt with to and through the city manager, and the manager is responsible for administrative service. So that the second slide was more of a general expression of things, and not necessarily a verbatim quote from the charter. But the important thing to consider here is this is not sort of a general policy of what should the hours of City Hall be or something like that. This is a specific question of can the council basically establish a policy telling the chief you need to finish within a specified matter of time all administrative reviews. And so that was the attempt to the manager being responsible for administrative service to and through him for personnel matters. We believe that's the most significant fact.
But so I guess I mean, just to refine the question a bit, one thing for the council to say, you know, in a specific case, you know, we're involved in a personnel matter, we will complete the investigation within a specified time limit. And is there a distinction from that and generally to say, you know, we are going to meet even the 1 year statute of limitations and not toll for civil or criminal reasons? Now, I understand the argument that's being made that, you know, there are other reasons, but just from a purely charter point of view, does the council have the authority to give that instruction?
And we believe no, because this is really a core personnel function in terms of the timing of things. And I agree with you, Mayor. What we tried to do is structure it two ways. First off, legally under the charter, can this be done? And then even sort of getting past that practically, what would be the consideration?
Because it's one thing to say, you know, the council can't take on the discretionary responsibility either for the police chief, in this case, the first level of review would be the police chief in terms of discipline. He's hiring authority. And then the city manager has, or an employee who's disciplined that has appeal rights to the city manager. And again, I would agree with you that the charter prohibits us from exercising or giving direction or usurping the discretion in a personnel matter with any department head. And then obviously the city manager's appellate discretion. And again, you know, it would be wrong for the city council to say, well, in this case, you know, we want this out. I think that would be a slippery slope. But generally, in terms of policies involving timelines, you're taking a step further and saying that the personnel, the discretion given to the administrative side of City Hall, the city manager, that in personnel matters, that discretion includes the procedural timelines that are to be followed.
The timing of when things could be imposed, and I think that might sort of bear fruit in different circumstances where an officer might say, you know, if you just wait for the DA to come back, or if you just wait for me to tell my story here, or if you just wait for this, and if the department or the chief were to say, I'm sorry, you know, we have to render, and on what we have, you know, here's my decision. And so I think, in a sense, I get where the mayor is saying it may be just kind of a timing thing, and it doesn't specifically speak to discipline itself. But the reality is that different evidence can arrive at different points in time, and Lieutenant described circumstances how detectives do try to gather evidence, and I think that the reality is not all the evidence is gathered the night of the shooting, and so things do tend to come in, and things do inform what they might do. So if there were a hard deadline, that could limit what the professional standard duties could take in and what they could send to the chief to consider.
So the statute of limitations in Government Code 3300, the state statute, Peace Officer Bill of Rights, applies to administrative and disciplinary review of an incident. But for the criminal investigation, there is no statute of limitations other than the criminal statute for if there are any charges brought, correct? But for us here locally, for any police department, to complete a criminal investigation, is there a statute of limitations?
Off of an officer-involved shooting, I'm not aware of any applicable limitations for the district attorney to come back and file charges on that. I think for some other crimes, there are some limitation periods, but I'm not sure if there are any relevant ones for the DA to come back. But the reality is that what we've seen is things can take not just a matter of months, but 1, 2, 3 years, and not just with this district attorney, but with the private one as well.
Well, I'm referring to the city's responsibility to conduct a criminal investigation.
Oh, just to move it along to file it with the district attorney? I'm not aware of any legal requirements for the detectives to move something along to a district attorney, whether it would be PPD or another agency might be looking at something.
So there, in that instance, the council could say, listen, within, depending on the complexity, but, if there is an incident involving, a shooting that occurs, or a use of force, or in custody death, the council say, we'd like those investigations, the criminal investigation, completed and submitted to the DA within.
We'd have to take a look at that. That involves criminal matters and ultimately could result in criminal prosecution. So I'm not sure how significant the role that council can play in formulating a policy in that regard.
And the other question, because one of the arguments is, or one of the rationale, part of the rationale used or stated to say, we need to ensure that there's a thorough investigation, including on the part of the DA, is subsequent charges may be brought. Charges or findings may be made by the DA, or statements may be made in civil litigation that inform either the police chief or the city manager's ultimate decision on discipline.
And if the chief had rendered before getting that information, the chief then would have already rendered, and so he would have sort of ceded his, at that point, he's done with his decision making. So that would be the argument, to wait until those conclusions come in.
But in the disciplinary process, there is no such thing as double jeopardy, correct? In other words, someone, let's assume for a moment, an officer says, no, I didn't, or any employee says, for that matter, says, during the investigation, something that has been contradicted in a deposition or by evidence produced by the district attorney. The city police department could then come back and bring subsequent charges against the officer or any employee for a different charge or a similar charge. For example, giving false statements during the investigation.
For something that might be a wholly independent charge, I think that is possible. I think if it were something that someone could argue that with reasonable diligence, the department could have discovered it earlier had they conducted a more thorough interview, for example, like Lieutenant Gordon mentioned, Internal Affairs has the ability to take compelled statements. Could they have taken that type of testimony when they took the compelled statements? But for an independent violation, that would sort of what's called restart the clock. One thing I did mention is the Peace Officer Bill of Rights has a 1-year limitation period from the date of discovery, but for purposes of these officer-involved shootings, like Lieutenant Gordon mentioned, the department hears about the shooting that night. So to calculate the 1 year, it's pretty easy to say 1 year from the shooting. If there were independent violations, then those would be tracked on their own time.
and I think that's the point. So it's the, let's play it the other way. And let's assume, there's a use of force or a shooting or an in custody death occurs on January 1st of 2020. The department, that's the date of discovery by someone in a position to initiate an investigation, and that starts the statute, correct?
Yes.
And so we have, it's actually not a year, it's 300, it's, sometimes there's a leap year involved in more days. But let's just assume for a moment that the city has until January 1st of 2021 to present the officer with an employee with the intent, if there's going to be discipline, a letter of intent to impose discipline.
Yes.
Now, if we don't toll the statute and the statute comes and goes, and on January 3rd of 2021, the DA then says, look, we reviewed this and we discovered that your investigation missed this point, which would have changed the outcome. Or there's a deposition on January 2nd that shows, something different than what our investigation showed. Can we reopen that case on the very specific charges underpinning the incident?
If it really could be shown that there were an independent violation, I think that's possible. But it really would depend on the circumstance. I think the mayor is correct. This is a complex area, and there is litigation still ongoing over the years in terms of what is something that should have been discovered by a supervisor, what is something that was part of the underlying violation, what is perhaps an independent violation. Those would be things that we'd have to look at. But if it is something that is truly independent, then that's something that would start its own clock.
There's a distinction there because people are, some people are saying, look, it's taking too long. And I think we all frustrated that sometimes the DA or other investigations do take too long because it's not healthy for the city. It's not healthy for even the officer. And in fact, that's the intent of OBAR, is to not have something hanging over a police department or an individual officer. But the counterpoint to that is we don't toll a statute and we act, and then there's information that would have changed the decision. Unless it's an independent charge, I'm hearing that if we try and reopen it, then the argument on the side of the officer and his or her attorney will be, well, should have caught it in your investigation. The statute came and went on January 1st. If you were going to discipline us, you should have given us notice on that specific.
Right, and the officers are entitled to a measure of due process, both in criminal investigation of officer-involved shooting, and then separately, if there's going to be any discipline that's going to be imposed, so they have rights that need to be respected as well.
Okay, let me turn to colleagues if there are any other questions. Hampton, did you want to?
Is there public comment? I'm fine with hearing the public comment first. And then if there are any other council members that have things to say, because I'd like to understand, what their thoughts are, because I will say that this is not exactly the conversation, but this is fine. This is a start, and it's definitely not a finish. And I will say that if we need to get another opinion, then we should do that. Because if our city attorney is saying that the opinion is we can't tell our city manager to, or we can't set a policy to say that employees should be, all city employees, not just officer-involved shootings, but all city employees should have not expedited, but within within a reasonable time frame. 12 months is not reasonable. That's what the state has given us. Most personnel investigations do not take this long. And they haven't even started a personnel investigation on the last officer involved shooting. So, but yeah, I'm interested in hearing the public comment. Sorry.
Okay. Did anybody want to address that? I think there's.
Mayor, I think I just want to clarify. I think the Lieutenant Gordon's presentation about the administrative review, that actually does start the day of the officer-involved shooting. Lieutenant Gordon did mention the.
I'm sorry. That's good to know. Is it complete?
So I don't want to get into any cases specifically, but the reality is that it does start that night, but for the most part, Internal Affairs does rely on detectives for evidence gathering. Ultimately, Internal Affairs is going to have to look at a different standard, which is the department policy, whereas detectives will look at the penal code, and they will, when they forward it on to the district attorney's office, that's what the DA's office will look at.
So let's roll it back a little bit. Incident occurs January 1st, 2021 or 2022. Incident occurs. We have two groups of officers who roll to a shooting or use of force incident. One is the administrative, and so, Lieutenant Gordon gets the call, and Lieutenant, you and your officers would handle the administrative aspect of that?
That is correct.
Okay, and that is separate and apart than a group of detectives who would roll out to a scene and investigate for criminal purposes, correct?
That's correct. They're two separate investigations. It's the same investigation, but we're doing two separate things.
Yeah. Now, so when you and your team rolls out, you start the administrative investigation that night, correct?
Yes.
And the detectives start the criminal investigation. It's two separate teams. Now, for interview purposes of people on scene, you conduct your interviews, and your interview, can an officer there's a police lieutenant, so can an officer in your situation be compelled to give a statement?
Yes.
Okay, can you just explain what that means?
Well, what it's called is called a lie barker. And so we compel them. It's the same thing. We read them their rights, and we tell them that it's mandatory for them to speak, to give us a statement. And at that point, they give us a statement. But I want to be clear that that's not something we do the first night.
Okay.
The first night, they get an opportunity. Everything is done through the criminal investigation process first. We don't start interviewing people or doing anything until the criminal investigation is completed. And that means that we get information from the DA's office, because something I probably didn't explain clearly that I'll explain clearly now, the DA's office could also send the case back and say, we want you to do further investigation. And then that means that our detectives would have to do further investigation. Or they'll tell us that whether or not it was justified or not. And that's the purpose of us waiting for the DA's office.
So what is it that you do when you and your team get the call on January 1st?
We look at policy.
Okay.
So we look for policy violations, we look at the training, and we look at the tactics.
Okay.
All of those things. We also get we get a lot of the facts that night. And some of the facts are discovered after that night, after they go out and talk to witnesses or look at video, looking at the map. I mean, I'd love to say that it's going to be done that night. And then evidence has to be sent to the lab. So there's a lot of things that goes on in this process. And it doesn't just start. I mean, it doesn't just finish here at the police department. It goes to other agencies. It could be the sheriffs that we're asking them to look at weapons or whatever that may be. But we have to wait for their response as well before we can put a complete case together.
And in the case of the criminal investigation, I'll look to the chief on this one. The detectives start the criminal investigation that night. That's a separate team from the lieutenant's team, right?
Absolutely, and historically, without talking about this case, historically, they finish those investigations within a few months and package it up and send it off to the DA's office. So ours locally, from a criminal standpoint, is done relatively quick at all. No timeline you give on these type of cases. Whenever you put a timeline, you're asking for incomplete.
Now, in the criminal investigation, in the administrative investigation, we can compel an officer, but in the criminal investigation, can we compel an officer to give up their, and by compelling, we mean you don't have you don't have a right to not answer the questions. You must answer the questions.
There's a sense of process. We have criminal reasons to read them the rights that night. That'll be.
I'm sorry. Can we just keep this this at the personnel investigation?
Sure,
Mayor, if you don't mind, because this is what I asked for. I asked for us to have a discussion about the personnel investigation. A criminal investigation, as our chief and our city attorney and Ms. Gordon has eloquently told us, they're separate investigations.
yeah.
What I'm asking for is these people are in our employ. These are employees of the city of Pasadena. Employees of the city of Pasadena. Okay? What the criminal investigation and what the DA is doing has nothing to do whatsoever. And you guys could argue this all day if you want to. Whatsoever with the DA's decision.
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I'm just trying to separate the two so we can focus exactly on what you're saying.
My answer is that there is no separation. At the end of the day, they're intertwined. The criminal investigation is one portion of the administrative investigation.
Gotcha.
For a police chief, you're looking at all aspects, all parts.
Gotcha.
And the criminal investigation is just one part of that total investigation.
Okay. Okay.
Mayor, I think just to clarify too, the staff that does the criminal investigation is not the same staff that does the administrative review. So the package that the administrative review folks see is the criminal investigation, but they are not part of the people asking questions or gathering evidence for the criminal investigation. They're two separate things, and the officers are entitled to due process not only in the criminal investigation, but independently with their personnel rights. So two separate groups.
To the Councilmember Hampton's point, the administrative is just the personnel. And so the criminal side does not have the right to look at anything associated with the admin. However, the other way around is the admin waits for the conclusion of the criminal to apply it to their investigation.
I do have a question of
Go ahead, Mr.
Lieutenant Gordon. During your personnel investigation, do you interview witnesses?
That really depends. It depends on my my detective sergeants and what they see. If they see something where they need to go out and ask questions that could be related to a policy violation, then absolutely we will interview a witness. But it's important that we get all the facts, get everything together before we start going out and start talking to witnesses.
Okay, let me ask you this question. Have you interviewed any witnesses in the Anthony McLean case?
Councilmember Hampton.
I can ask that question. It's a question. I mean, I just want to know if she's interviewed.
I understand. Councilmember Hampton, I think this is intended to be a general sort of presentation to talk about.
Well, that's officer. Okay, that's all. Okay, well, let me go to the. Should I go to? We've had officer-involved shooting, so I'm giving a reference. So should I
understand,
reference
Councilmember Hampton, but I think
Anthony
we want to
McLean?
keep this general, which is what's on the agenda, and we're not.
No,
getting
I'm trying to
into
understand.
specific matters.
I mean, it's not helpful if I don't understand exactly who's interviewed or not.
Councilmember, we don't discuss ongoing personnel matters in public.
Okay, well, let's go.
The
Let's go to a
personnel
hold
matter is
No.
within the administrative services under the city manager. It's not appropriate in this forum to discuss it with the Public Safety Committee.
Okay.
Let's ask the question a little bit differently in general. At what point, Lieutenant Gordon, would you begin to ask questions of witnesses administratively before or after a criminal investigation is complete?
It would be after the criminal investigation is complete, because at that time we have all the facts.
Okay. Mr. Hampton, do you have another question?
Yeah, that just kind of goes back to my whole entire thing that we're waiting for a criminal investigation to see if a person is actually capable of actually doing their job. It's very simple. They're in our employ. You don't have to be a criminal to get fired or disciplined. You do not have to be a criminal in the real world. And just like this is the real world, by the way, you do not have to be a criminal to get fired or be out of policy. The question is, we need to finish our investigations of the personnel matters, of all personnel matters. And this could be for the city manager or whoever the next city manager will be, right? I mean, this should be a policy that the city council sets forth to say, we should do our investigations within a timely fashion. 12 months, and this is not even 12 months, by the way, because this has gone on past 12 months because you're saying that the DA office has requested you not to, or is that right, Javon? The DA has requested you to hold off on the investigation, or they have other questions about some of the investigations sometimes? I'm just speaking broads.
That, I guess, Lieutenant Gordon was sharing that that's sometimes the case. She wasn't speaking to any specific cases.
Councilmember, though, let me respond to what you said. You're absolutely right. I believe Javon covered this in the PowerPoint. There are instances where an agency may move forward with completing the administrative review. The case that Javon referred to was that terrible incident in Long Beach where a school resource officer fired into a moving vehicle that was not coming at him, was going away from him, and killed that poor 18-year-old mother. They took action. They terminated the officer because the facts in that case were so egregious that the policy violations were there on their face. I do believe that in other instances, such action is appropriate. It is based on the sum total of facts in a particular case. To your other point about establishing a city policy that we should complete administrative reviews within any particular time frame, as I understand the analysis of the city attorney's office, is based on our city charter. The council does not make personnel policies. The council has 3/4 direct reports. The city manager promulgates the personnel rules. Certainly the city council can tell the city manager, hey, we think you ought to do all admin reviews in a timely fashion. The manager benefits from getting input from the council members. But as I understand the requirements of our charter, it falls short of giving the council the authority to establish that personnel policy per se. Manager, of course, needs to listen to the council and take that into consideration. There are at times other factors that would argue against completing an administrative review, and lots of times the presence of, in this case, as we've been discussing today, the potential of criminal charges and civil litigation play into that. I've often said to people in the wake of an incident when they want to see something resolved quickly, but there's litigation, I say it's unfortunate, but the litigation and the fact that court systems move so slowly frustrates the timeline on getting things done quickly, which is somewhat ironic in my view, sir.
Thank you. But at the end of the day, this conversation, thank you, City Manager. I really appreciate that. This is based on an opinion of our city attorney. An opinion. This is not legal. This is not a judge that has come down on high and said, Pasadena, you cannot do this. This is the opinion of our city attorney's office. The opinion. So how about we move forward with the policy and then see what happens? Or get another opinion. No offense, Javon. I don't mean that, but I think you're a great city attorney. But or get another opinion from an actual judge.
I think that the attorney's office would characterize their communication as advice, which the client counsel can act upon.
Right. Okay. So this is advisory. So the city attorney is advising us. Okay. So this is advice to the mayor. So we could go forward with the policy we could go forward with the policy and say to the city manager, this is what we would like to see in all personnel investigations. We could do that. We could do that anyways, right? Because we can. And it would be up to someone or organization, which happens all the time, right? Or anybody, to challenge it once we're in a position where we have to actually uphold that. But this is a personnel investigation. I'm not talking about a criminal investigation. Once again, we're talking about the personnel investigation. If an officer, a trash truck driver, someone in the health department is not doing their job properly, they should not be an employee of the city of Pasadena. It's very simple. You either do your job right or you do it wrong. You don't have to get a criminal investigation to fire someone.
Councilmember, I would just
And I understand
say,
that. Oh, go ahead.
well, I would say there are things that if an employee does as an egregious violation of city policy, it may necessitate them being terminated. Discipline is a continuum. Sometimes there'll be a policy violation. Every policy violation does not result in a termination. In certain instances, it may result in additional training for an employee. They may receive time off without pay. They may, if it's a police officer, they may be reduced in rank. And so there's more to it than just, you violate a policy, you're out. It depends what is the nature of that violation, how egregious is it. All of that relies on an investigation. And again, as we're discussing, in cases where the district attorney is involved and there's also potential criminal liability for those involved, the investigation waits for the benefit of that investigation.
Okay. I have a question. Have you ever fired anyone who has had?
To me?
This is directed to you. Have you ever fired anyone who has had a criminal lawsuit pending?
I've certainly fired people. I can't recall whether someone had a criminal case pending against them, but in my 32 plus years, I've certainly terminated people for all sorts of things.
Okay. So we had an embezzlement. How did all those people get fired? I guess like Tyrone Wooten. Did we have to wait for him to get criminally charged to fire him, or did they fire him immediately?
And I think that's getting a little far afield from the agenda.
It's really not, because it's public information.
I can respond to that.
Okay, I'm only bringing up public information.
He had left the city before criminal charges were brought for unrelated reasons.
So let me ask you this. So are we refusing, because this is what it sounds like to me, because there's a lot of words happening. Are we refusing to do a personnel investigation until the DA is done with their criminal investigation?
The presentation here isn't to say that the department would refuse to do that. It's merely that the department has wide latitude under the charter. Generally speaking, it's a good idea for the department to defer completing the administrative review, but there can be reasons why the department might want to accelerate it. So really, it could go. They have options, and I think the city manager explained that, and he recognizes there are options. The reality is that most of the time, it may be best practices to defer, waiting for the district attorney to reach their conclusion at a minimum.
But Javon, I think, Mr. Hampton, if I may, so Mr. Hampton's point is, well, his point is, we can give direction, and, whether that's followed or not is a different story. But what I'm hearing from you, Mr. Rad, and the police officer's presentation, the lieutenant's presentation, is we wait for the criminal investigation to complete it, and the chief is saying that usually takes what, Chief, 2 or 3 months for the criminal investigation?
For the criminal investigation on the police department's side of it, might take just a few months.
A few months.
It's hard to give it a number, but usually that's for 6 months on average, and we package it up and send it over to the DA's office, and they conduct their review.
Okay, so that's different than waiting for the DA. And that's, I think, Mr. Hampton's point is we're waiting for the DA when we've already had the benefit of a complete criminal investigation and made a determination. And so help us reconcile that piece of it.
In which format?
Well, I guess I'm hearing we wait until the criminal investigation is complete, and then we begin asking questions. And
it's fair to say the
from an administrative perspective,
the criminal investigation is completed on our end when we interview all potential witnesses. We wait for evidence. Sometimes it takes longer than we want. It could take longer than 6 months. You could wait for DNA to come back on items. You could be waiting for ballistics on certain things to occur. All that could it's timely. But once we're done with all what we think needs to be done, it gets packaged up and sent to the district attorney's office for their process, which is to review all the content and the legal ramifications of the law.
So I guess that's where where the rub is, if you will. Fine, let's complete the criminal investigation. In most instances, it's a matter of months. In some instances, it maybe we're waiting for some lab work from the sheriff or FBI, whoever it may be, and may take longer. But at that point, what I'm hearing Mr. Hampton say is, why wait for the DA to render a decision on the criminal charges if through our criminal investigation and discipline or administrative review,
so the criminal investigation,
why not proceed?
Absolutely. So the criminal investigation does not give a conclusion on the criminal aspect. They're submitting all the information, all the evidence, all the pieces, all the exhibits. They're packaging it together. They're not making a conclusion or a recommendation or an opinion. So what can happen in these cases from a district attorney's standpoint, they take these, they also have their own DA investigators. They may go out and re-interview witnesses. They may re-look at crime scenes. They may conduct things that we've already done. So we are just supplying them with all that we've done, and they then review all that information. So they may want to redo some of that. They may not. At the end of the day, when it's all finished on their end, the chief of police has a responsibility to render on the policy, procedures, equipment, the law, any supervisory issues, and then training issues that might pop up at all. All those have to be reviewed by the chief of police on every administrative investigation. And so that may include waiting for the DA's final recommendation on the law for me to make a final conclusion on the entire investigation. So for me, for any chief that you would talk to anywhere in the state of California, United States, it would not be a full, complete investigation without the DA's report.
So the DA, does the DA report, because that's a decision that you have discretion to make, right? Because if our internal criminal investigation is complete, you could say, okay, now I'm going to render a finding based on the administrative investigation that started on day one, but maybe isn't complete. The criminal investigation is complete. The administrative investigation is complete. You could say, now I'm going to render a decision on discipline and not wait for the DA to make a decision.
Absolutely.
Now, the DA makes findings or provides findings only on the criminal aspect, or there are other areas, tactics and training that the DA weighs in on, correct?
No, Mayor, the district attorney generally only looks at whether the officer's actions are justified under California law, and so that's essentially what they look at. The chief explained a lot of things that he goes through, and on one of the slides we put up policy 310, which is a fairly detailed policy that the department has that talks about what the professional standards unit would explore, and that would include policies, tactics, training, supervision, all those things the chief mentioned. That's not necessarily up to the DA to decide. The DA, when the DA completes their portion of the criminal investigation, they generally issue what's called either a clearance letter if the officer's actions were justified, and so the chief could benefit from the writing in that letter, or if there are criminal charges filed, the chief can benefit from the criminal complaint.
To add to that, there's the criminal findings is basically what we don't render on. That is the DA's office. But in their report, they will offer insight to case law related to decision making and tactics. And so that's also important for us to review. It's not what they render on, whether it's in the law or not in the law. They have to do that with the officer involved shooting. But there's also narrative there that's very glaring for a police chief to look at from the DA's perspective when it comes to situations where you talk about case law and other things on tactics, and also as it relates to decision making by the officer.
Okay. So that's they may not render a finding, but they give insight. Is what you're saying.
They're not going to have a legal finding on the officer's decision making or his tactics for the most part. It will be just about the shooting, but they can stretch into that area if they felt there was a need to.
Mr. Hampton, did you have anything else?
I did have one question, and this is for the gamut of the table: the city attorney, city manager, the police chief. I mean, so someone can answer this question: has anyone ever fired an employee of the city that has criminal charges pending?
Councilmember, I don't know the answer to that question. Again, a workforce of nearly 2,000, city's been around a long time, people have been terminated.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I can answer that. As I sit here and I think about it, yes, I can think of an instance where an employee was terminated and there were criminal charges pending.
Okay, perfect. That's great news. So that answers the question. Someone could be disciplined with a criminal case pending. The top boss, the city manager, the boss of all bosses, has just let us know that is a possibility and that's something that could happen. So once again, I'm going to say this again. We do not need to wait for a criminal investigation to be completed to determine if a person should be working or in the city of Pasadena's employ. Period.
Yep, Councilmember, let me just add a little bit
it's
of
all
flavor
good.
to that. No, that's fine.
You guys are trying to wordsmith me today. I get it. Okay, fine.
I said what you wanted me to say, but let me just add a little bit more. In the instance that I'm thinking of, the employee had criminal charges against them, and then we terminated them, as opposed to terminating someone, and then someone was literally charged, they committed a crime, or they were accused of committing a crime, and because of those actions, that led to their termination. When it involves, let's say, officer-involved shootings, we're waiting for the district attorney to tell us whether they believe a crime has occurred or not. And again, as mentioned earlier, they are independent. Again, as the example for Long Beach, in certain cases, when certain activity is so egregiously violative of policy, it may be appropriate to take action. And we're not saying that would never be the case. But we're saying it's a case-by-case assessment.
Right. What we are saying, though, is that we are not going to finish or complete a personnel matter that is based on actual policy that are put in place by the city, by the Pasadena Police Department, by its employees, until there is a criminal investigation complete. I find that to be...
I don't actually think that we're actually saying...
Well, there's no criminal... and I can't speak on actual cases because Javon has already told me that. But I have emails that say that an actual case that is underway right now has not even started the personnel investigation. The personnel investigation is not even complete. My question is, if a person is within policy or not, it's very simple. If I'm out of policy, do I have to wait for the criminal investigation to complete for you to fire me? If I went down the street and just started slapping everybody, and would you wait for a criminal investigation for me, for you to say, you know what, I'm going to put you on unpaid leave, I have you on video doing X, Y, Z? No, you're not going to wait. You're going to terminate me.
And we said as much.
Right. And we have video. So I'm saying we have a personnel investigation that needs to be complete, and it needs to be complete in a timely fashion. No community member, nor should any police officer have to wait years for them to get some sort of discipline when it's normally some sort of slap on the wrist or whatnot. We want to know, have you finished the personnel investigation? Is this person still in the employ? And in some cases, these people are still in the employ. And mainly, in more cases, more so often, which I've seen, this be the police department. No offense, Chief. I know. But I'm saying there tends to be this secondary standard of police officers and firefighters, that they're untouchable until a criminal investigation is complete. No, there's a personnel investigation that needs to be complete, and we need to make our renderings. And I mean, well, not we, but you need to make the renderings. And so the policy that I'm setting forth is saying, hey, it says within 12 months, the state. Can we do it within 90 days? Can we do it within 120 days? And as Javon mentioned, there are other agencies that have let people go. What I'm trying to get at is, if a person should not be working, we should do our investigation to see if they are even capable of doing that job. It's very simple. Can you do your job or can you not do your job? Are you afraid of people or are you not afraid of people? Whatever the policy questions are. Did you turn on your body-worn camera or did you not turn on your body-worn camera? Did you shoot when you shouldn't have shot or did you not shoot? It's all on video. We have videos now. Did you sit on someone's back while they were in restraints? I mean, these are questions that people are asking. Accountability starts with employment. It's very simple. It's not a criminal accountability. It's employment.
Yeah, I agree with Councilmember Hampton. What we're hearing is, in this regard, what we're hearing is there's nothing that prevents us, but what our staff is saying is we're exercising our discretion to handle it this way, to wait for the criminal investigation and wait for the DA to weigh in. Now then, the subsequent question is, what can the council give instruction to change that? That's a separate question, and the city attorney is saying, no, you can't. You have professional staff who are hired to handle this. The charter says they handle it. So Mr. Hampton's point is, I think that this is a decision, a discretionary decision that the city manager and the chief are making. The city attorney is saying, well, they have the discretion to do that, and city council, you don't. And then it becomes a question of whether the council wants, as Mr. Hampton is suggesting, wants to give a different direction and then see if it's challenged or if it causes the city to incur liability or causes, in some cases, discipline that maybe might have been handled differently if we waited, as the chief and the city manager suggesting it is appropriate to do. That's the question. Anyone else before we, Mr. Hampton, Mr. Kennedy, or Mr. Madison? But I think Mr. Hampton's point is correct. That's what I'm hearing. That's what we're hearing, right? But what we're hearing is, in the staff's estimation, the best, most appropriate way to handle things. Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Madison, see.
Mr. Kennedy, may I go ahead? I don't know if you had your hand up before I do. Okay, thank you. And I appreciate Mr. Hampton's questions and the colloquy very much. I mean, I would say I'm not sure this is capable of a simple formula. And I just want to make sure I understand the different legal processes that could initiate or incept when hypothetically there's an officer involved shooting. So, and I guess Mr. Rad, you're the person whom I'm directing these questions to, but I'd invite any other staff to comment as appropriate. I mean, so there may be a criminal investigation related to the conduct that was being investigated by the officer prior to the officer involved shooting. And I realize this is a hypothetical. I'm assuming that there was some nature of police contact or investigation. And it is certainly possible, isn't it, that there could be a criminal investigation related to that subject matter. Is that fair to say?
Councilmember Madison, is it, so I understand your question is that in some instances there may be a police investigation already ongoing independent of the shooting, that then a shooting happens? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is that officer involved shootings sometimes arise, probably usually arise in the course of some manner of police activity or investigation. I mean, just again, hypothetically, I want to try not to get into specifics, but let's say there's a commercial burglar alarm that goes off. Officers respond, find signs of forced entry, go into the building to investigate, and there's an officer involved shooting. So there is a criminal investigation, or was, or may be, of the conduct that led the officers to that place and time. Am I right? Okay.
Sure.
Right. Then there is a personnel related administrative investigation of the officer who's involved in the officer involved shooting.
Right, and in the circumstance that you described, if there's sort of activity that that precedes the shooting, I think the department would look at all the relevant activity that precedes the shooting. Sometimes it's a minute or two. Sometimes it could be a matter of hours or whatever it might be. But I think the department would want to get the complete picture, and I think that's first through detectives.
Wait, slow down. You're losing me right now. I'm just trying to. If you imagine a page and there's a heading, and I'm just trying to understand the different legal pathways that are incepted in this hypothetical situation. So we've already identified one, which is there may be a criminal investigation of the conduct that the officers were investigating or involved in at the time of the officer involved shooting, right?
Sure.
Okay. Then the second sort of bucket or category would be if you assume an officer involved shooting, is there always an administrative investigation by the department of the circumstances and facts related to the officer involved shooting?
Yes.
Okay.
If they for a member of the public too, yes. Mm.
Pardon?
For example, they also, I think, at some level would look at accidental discharges. That's still an officer involved shooting as well. There might be an officer involved shooting where someone where they're not hit. Officer involved shooting where they're hit, where they survive, and an officer involved shooting.
Let me ask Lieutenant Gordon, if I could. Lieutenant Gordon, anytime there's an officer involved shooting, is there an administrative investigation conducted by the police department?
Yes.
Okay. And is that the investigation that implicates Pobar and Liebarger?
Yes.
So, as I understand, in that instance, the officers are facing potentially, and I'm not in the hypothetical prejudging the facts or making any sort of determinations one way or the other, But just by virtue of the fact that there's an administrative investigation of their conduct on duty, the Police Officers' Bill of Rights provides certain checks and balances on that. And the Leibarger case says that although we can compel them as a condition to further employment to make a statement, that statement can't be used beyond that employment investigation. Is that a fair enough summary?
That is correct.
So then the third category might be a criminal investigation that ensues from the same facts of the officer involved shooting or the use of force. And we've seen many instances now where there have been criminal investigations and charges of the officers related to their conduct in that incident. So would that be like the third bucket potentially?
Yes.
And that could be a state or local investigation, or it could be a federal investigation. The FBI, for example, could intervene and investigate whether or not federal civil rights violations under color of law occurred, or state and local authorities could conduct a criminal investigation into whether there was some violation of state or local law, again, by the officer in that use of force. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Then, very frequently in these cases, there is civil litigation. I guess I can turn back to Mr. Rod on this one, that civil litigation that's initiated by representatives of the individual that was, shot or the subject of a use of force, and or family members or other interested parties against the department and the officers and the city, right?
Yeah.
And then there could also be civil litigation potentially by the officers if there's a violation of POBAR or of their employment rights, both in terms of the procedural handling of the investigation or the ultimate determination that's made by the chief as a result of that. Isn't that right?
Yes.
I mean, I'm aware of cases where officers, so by my count, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, as many as 6 separate legal processes that incept in this type of situation. And they pretty much all have different rules, different procedures, different consequences. And let me just ask though, am I missing any? Is there anything else there that I'm missing?
I think Councilmember Madison, from time to time, for after officer-involved shootings and one time in custody deaths, we've done independent reviews as well.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good catch. So there could also be an independent review requested by the city and conducted by a third party, such as the Office of Independent Review or the like, correct?
Yes. And that's about what I can think of.
And like in that instance, again, without talking about any specific case, but just generally, what is the potential outcome of that? Is that simply in the nature of a consulting engagement in which the city is examining best practices, or does it inform the other legal outcomes, or what?
It probably wouldn't directly inform the other legal outcomes. A lot of times the independent reviews follow one thing or another, whatever the city might like to have reviewed. What we've done in Pasadena is we've had the independent reviewer basically review the review of the chief's determination of whether the officer acted within policy, and at an underlying level, a review of the shooting itself in terms of how the officers performed with tactics, training, that kind of matters.
And I would just add a third value of doing an independent review, again, as Javon indicated, reviewing the thoroughness of the work done in-house in the police department, identifying possible improvements to tactics and training. And then I think a third important point, a well-done review will help the public understand the nature of a critical incident. The last one that we did was Reginald Thomas Jr. That was performed by Rick Brazil. We made that report public. There were no redactions. It provides a very clear narrative. So people who want to understand better what happened, I think that can go a long way to sharing with the interested public exactly what goes on in the wake of an incident, well, what went on during an incident.
So I just want to stay for a minute on this idea that we've already seen like one example where Leibarger says we may be able to compel an officer to give us a statement as a condition to continued employment, but under POBAR and under the case law, that statement can't be used. And I'm aware of the seriousness of that legal rule, even to the point that if prosecutors, for example, even were exposed to those statements, that could taint any potential criminal prosecution. So are there other instances where I'm thinking now, for example, about, let's say there is a DA investigation. Is it possible that the chief could consider the results of that investigation in his determination as to whether discipline was appropriate, or if so, what discipline?
Councilor Madison, that if the DA were to reach a conclusion before the chief were to render, that's absolutely something the chief can rely on. At the end of the day, the chief needs to make his own findings, make his own rendering, but it's always helpful to be informed by other sources, and the DA's office does have a special justice system integrity division that does look into officer-involved shootings. So it is something that the chief can benefit from as he considers things. If the chief were to render beforehand, again, generally speaking, there probably should be something sufficiently serious and sufficiently obvious of a policy violation for the chief to render before receiving that type of information. The DA's letters, which they post on their website, and they've done that for the last several years, they tend to be anywhere from 5 or 6 pages to 70, 80, 90 pages. So they are very detailed, and I do think chiefs do benefit from those documents.
And that's appropriate.
I can only add to those comments is that as a chief, not having all the investigations in front of me to conclude on the administrative investigation is just completely incomplete. It's just, I am missing nothing worse than to make a rendering on a decision only to find out after the fact there were missing holes or a missing investigation I did not read, and that I have to admit to that somewhere. And that's just not the professional way to complete an entire investigation. You need all elements and every investigation. It could even be debated waiting for the outcome of civil cases on mediation. It could be about waiting for independent reports as well. All that is important, as I have to view not only with an administrative investigation the penalties against an officer for discipline, but also looking at rewriting policy, equipment, and all these other issues that come up related to running a police department. There's a lot more to it than just one aspect of one investigation.
So I take it it's within the chief's discretion to weigh the evidence that the chief has available at such time as he or she has that evidence available, and then to determine whether there's additional evidence that will present itself for analysis and then make a judgment about what the appropriate timing as well as the appropriate outcome is of any potential discipline.
Correct.
True. Yeah. And I think, I would hope we can all agree that, and goodness knows, reasonable minds can differ here. But I would hope we would all agree that we want, and that as a city, we will do better for ourselves and our residents if we reach fair and just conclusions that are supported by the law and the facts and the policies and procedures that are in place at the time of every incident. Okay, I don't think I have any more questions, Mayor, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Madison. And you know, that again brings us back to Councilmember Hampton's point that they're to sort of wrap up the chief's statement. The chief and the city manager are saying we could proceed without it, but it's not in the city's interest to proceed that way, and we're exercising our discretion. It always leaves open the question whether the council wants to, as a body, say something different or handle it different. Again, that's I think the missing link in all of this was the chief. What you just highlighted and what the chief just stated is yes, within my discretion, and I'm exercising my discretion because I believe it to be in the city's best interest.
And Mayor, I would say that that decision is based on a totality of the circumstances of particular events, which by definition will always be different. No two incidents are the same. There's different factors involved. And so the chief does use his discretion based on what he knows, short of a full, complete DA investigation or an admin review. And I am certain that in certain circumstances, if a policy violation was viewed to be so egregious by the chief that he felt someone needed to be terminated, he would move on that. And in my role as city manager, I would support him completely.
But Mayor, if I could just follow up on your comments, I don't think the city council has visibility because of the legal rules and requirements into the information where we would even be able to make that determination, would we?
Well, that's the question. The city attorney is saying no. Mr. Hampton is suggesting, not suggesting, but stating, we could do that and then see if somebody challenges or if it causes problems with an investigation or it causes city liability. I don't want to speak for Mr. Hampton, but that's what I'm hearing.
But my reading of the charter is that the city manager oversees the employees of the city, not the city council. And in fact, we're legally prohibited from that. And legally, I don't believe we have the right to learn confidential employment investigative information.
Well, that's the other question. Is I guess we'll get to that, and maybe we're there, as you like to point out, Mr. Madison. Does the council have the authority to ask? So members of the public have said, city council agendize a particular incident. A number of incidents, it's been suggested that we agendize it for a discussion here at city council, and then take action or direct the manager or the chief to take action. Would that be a lawful process, one, under the charter, two, under state statute? And what would be the implication if it's not?
For purposes of considering a personnel matter, it wouldn't be appropriate under the charter on a case-by-case basis. If there was something that were potential litigation or litigation that the council just wanted to get information, that would be something that we could agendize in a closed session discussion with the council. But the other thing is that for police officers in particular, they have protections through state law, what's called the Pitches statutes, and they have confidentiality over their personnel records, particularly as things are pending. And so it really would be difficult to schedule something for a public discussion on this, and particularly in broad sense.
Well, what's your view, Ken? Could we, as some have suggested, agendize for a personnel discussion to give instruction or even take action? Forget about whether we have the authority or not. Could we agendize a discussion on any one particular incident to take a personnel action or give direction that personnel action be taken?
If it's not the manager, the clerk, or the city attorney, city prosecutor, no.
Okay. And you mentioned closed session. We could have some access, but would that be for personnel?
No, that would be to give direction to legal counsel on how to handle a particular civil litigation matter, and not with respect to any criminal process, and not with respect to personnel.
Okay, that's the question, is could we agendize either an open session or closed session, a discussion on any employee that's not our direct report, the city manager, the city clerk, or the city attorney, for a personnel discussion? That's the question, and I'm hearing no, not in open session or closed session.
I think it would be difficult.
Mr. Kennedy, you
be very brief. I've waited patiently, and that's rare. What I'd like to know, just very quick answers, Javon, if you will. Have we ever had an officer in the Pasadena Police Department who voluntarily gave a statement after a critical incident and resulting in the death of someone?
I seem to recall some. I don't know specific matters, but yes.
Any since you have been in the employee of the city of Pasadena?
Yes.
Okay. And does the city council have supervening authority to fire any employee? And if so, does the charter allow the city council supervening authority to fire any employee with a vote of 5 from the council?
No, just the council appointees that are set forth in the charter.
Can the city council require by a 5 vote for the city manager to take an action?
Of an employee subordinate to the manager?
Yes.
I would say no, and for the reasons set forth in the PowerPoint, where we talk about the charter sort of separation of duties and sort of the general notion of council manager form of government. So the council appoints a manager to perform those duties.
Are you aware of any Supreme Court case, California Supreme Court case, or California Supreme Court case, or any recent legislation that would cause you to be a little bit more ambivalent about that statement?
Not off the top of my head.
Okie doke. As it relates to the tolling of the statute, if it is called tolling of the statute in this case, and the specific case is Mr. Anthony McLean vis-a-vis police officers who were engaged in that matter or identified to be a part of that matter, is there in fact toiling of the statute of limitation for discipline? internal?
So where there is criminal investigation, where it is not yet completed, and where there's civil litigation that's ongoing, yes, the limitation period would be told.
Okay, and that would be applicable in this case, is that correct?
I believe so.
Okay, thank you. And is there any jurisdiction in the state of California where a city manager or a police chief, is there any jurisdiction that you're aware of in the state of California where a city manager or police chief has disciplined an officer, resulting in the termination of the officer prior to the completion of the criminal investigation, whether it be misdemeanor or a felonious or a felony?
The example that I would offer is the Long Beach Unified School District safety officer from a couple of weeks ago. I don't know the specifics, but I am not personally aware that a civil suit was filed or that criminal charges have been filed, and that officer was terminated. Again, I don't know the specifics of how the organization is set up and
save
what
that
process they have gone through.
Save that particular matter, but any other matter, because that is a unique case, I think, and I'm wondering, just so we'll have a common understanding, are you aware of any organization that has taken that step without the completion?
I'm not aware in California. There is actually a U.S. Supreme Court case where an employee was arrested for drug felonies and was then terminated, put on unpaid leave, then terminated, and then the Supreme Court upheld that termination outside of California.
With the number of recent laws signed recently by the governor related to law enforcement specifically, do any of those laws have any impact on the questions that Councilmember Hampton has put to you or the police chief or the city manager?
I don't think so, because I think what this discussion largely involves is a question of a municipal affair, personnel within a charter city, and I'm not aware of any legislation signed by the governor that would really guide us one way or another on this discussion.
And then to the city manager, is there a way that this council or your office could keep the community better informed of the process when we have an officer involved shooting, whether it results in death or not? Is there a better way to keep the community informed?
Councilmember,
Yes.
yeah, on numerous occasions at this committee, community meetings, been present when we've explained to people the various processes that take place following an officer-involved shooting or another critical incident. So, and it's been explained several times. I can talk to the chief about perhaps making sure that we have a process flow chart available for people on the website to look at. But conversation has been had numerous times over the years, not to the depth of today's conversation, but what happens in the wake of a critical incident, officer-involved shooting and the like. has been articulated many, many times in my memory.
And lastly, do you believe, Mr. City Manager, that you have the legal latitude to fire a police officer without a completed internal and external investigation of the facts after an officer-involved shooting that results in death of the suspect?
Yeah, let me try to give a precise answer. In the first instance, the chief would decide discipline, and under certain circumstances, and I've said numerous times this afternoon, I believe in a certain case where the chief felt someone's policy violations were so egregious that it necessitated termination, he would do that. That affected employee would have the right to appeal that decision. I would be the person that they would appeal it to. It has happened in my career with this chief. And I would either uphold the chief's decision or I would modify it or deny it. And of course, that individual, if they still felt aggrieved, could pursue civil litigation. And such cases have occurred.
As a final arbiter, let me ask it a different way. As the final arbiter of our internal city process, do you believe you have the authority to fire any employee, period? Because they are all, unless you tell me otherwise, at-will employees.
That, Councilmember, no, they're not all at-will employees. We have very, very, very few at-will employees in the city. So do I believe I have the authority to fire an employee for appropriate cause? 100%.
Any employee, correct?
Other than the city clerk, the city attorney / prosecutor, and those that report to them.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Mayor.
Mr. Hampton, and then we'll turn to public comment.
So I'm just going to reiterate the point because it's gotten all over the place from criminal and employment. And now it has to be, it does not have to be, let me ask the city managers. Do you believe that an employee should only be fired if it was egregious and not just for someone being out of policy on numerous occasions? It has to be egregious.
Well, I would say it depends on what the policy violations were. Let's use an example. Maybe we have a trash truck operator who's had 20 accidents. That probably rises to the level of separation because a trash truck is a very heavy piece of equipment that can do a lot of damage.
Okay, that fair. And so to my colleagues, I mean, this is really up to us and what we're going to decide to do. I mean, how long should an unqualified officer who violates policy should be allowed to roam the streets with a badge and a gun before they're fired? Or any employee in general? These questions are really, I'm stating these to my colleagues because at this point there's just a circulation of. Or let me ask my colleagues this: do you think suffocating someone to death is egregious? No one wants to answer that question because it is, and that's the reason why. I'm not even going to mention what I was about to say. Let me just say that we have to do a better job at holding people accountable in general, and it starts with the city manager and the police chief and all of our direct reports. A charge for someone not doing their job properly, especially with a badge and a gun, should be a reason to have them terminated or put them in a different position. within the city. If you can't terminate them, they shouldn't be out on the streets with a badge and gun. Suffocating someone to death is hella egregious. I mean, I'm going to use that word. And no one was fired for that. Shooting someone in the back twice is beyond egregious. Putting a video up saying that, oh, this is exactly what happened in the city's voice is egregious. So I'm only mentioning these cases because these are cases that have actually happened while we've actually been on the council, and nothing has happened. Personnel investigations get dragged out for a very long time, going on 3-4 years. No one knows exactly what's going to happen. Next thing you know, same people are back out on the streets doing the same exact thing. Well, not killing people, but I'm saying doing the same thing because there was no checks and balances. We have to hold employees accountable to the policies that they uphold to. Otherwise, what's the purpose of the policy? We do not have to wait for a criminal investigation, once again, to let a police officer or any employee of the city, anybody in the employee of the city, fired or terminated or disciplinary action. Example, Baskin Gordikian. When this came into public safety, Mayor, you and I here at Public Safety, I said multiple times, this person should not be an employee of the city. Over and over and over again, I was asked to not say anything about, but they didn't do a personnel investigation. Personnel investigation hadn't even started. We're waiting for the criminal investigation to complete before we finish the personnel investigation. Well, we found that Baskin was selling guns to our previous chief. And we waited for years, let this man get paid, sat on the city dime for almost 2 years before he was terminated. And he was only terminated because they found him guilty of a criminal act. He was outside of policy. So, I mean, we could just sit here and do nothing or ask our next city manager or this city manager to put something in place to make sure that people are, even for the police officer, why should a police officer have to wait around for 3 years for their investigation to come up to find out if they're going to have their job or not? And why should the community have to have an officer or any employee on the street that has been violating policy? I mean, those are my statements. I mean, you guys are going to decide to do what you want to do. I think this still needs to come to the full city council because that was my request. So we could have this full discussion with the rest of the council members, and if everybody just decides that they're totally fine with unqualified people working for the city of Pasadena, that's fine. I'm just letting you guys know that I'm not fine with that. And we need to finish personnel investigations in timely manners. And you do not have to be a criminal to be fired in this world. Or you don't need criminal and investigation to be fired in this world. If you're not doing your job, if you're doing a bang-up job, if you're outside of policy, in most places, you get terminated. Accountability is key. Thank you. I'd like to hear public comment, and then if there's anything else, I'll chime in.
Thank you, Mr. Hampton.
Mayor, if I could just, I'll be really brief. I just think that Mr. Hampton makes a lot of sense in the statements that he's making, but I would just say that he's respectfully, the facts are included in the question. And what I think we've walked through tonight is that we aren't in a position yet to know all of the relevant facts and the decision of the appropriate city officials about those facts yet. And the other thing that I may have misheard this, but there was a reference to Lieutenant Gordikian selling guns to a previous chief. And I'm just not aware of those facts.
I'm sorry, to his wife, I meant to say. I apologize. To his wife.
Okay. I'm not sure I'm aware of those facts either, but, that was a unique case as well. And I think, we have to stand for as a city that, these cases get decided on the facts and the law. And due process is important in every respect. It's important for members of the community that are confronted with the police power. It's important for the city and the police when there are, serious allegations and concerns. And I think we have to stay the course and not rush to judgment on these things until we have all the facts before us.
Councilman Madison, I have a quick question for you. Do you think that suffocating someone to death while they're in restraints is egregious?
Absolutely, I do. If it's
okay.
If you're referring to the George,
no, I'm just asking you. I'm not asking about George Floyd. George Floyd is. I'm not asking about that. I'm just asking you the question.
Yeah, I was appalled by what I saw in the George Floyd case, and absolutely justice was done in that case. There's no question.
Turn to public.
Okay, and that was
by that I just want to be clear, because in this world, people can misunderstand. That officer was correctly, in my view, charged and convicted of homicide. That was flat out an illegal homicide that occurred by that officer. And how those other officers didn't intervene and stop him is beyond me.
Right. Councilman Madison, do you believe it is? Let me ask you this question. I just want to understand where everybody's kind of coming from. Do you think it is dangerous if an unqualified officer roams the city with a badge and a gun?
When you say unqualified,
I'm just saying, if you're an officer that is out of policy, it doesn't seem like we would know what the qualifications are because no one's actually doing those investigations. But would you say that if you believe that someone was, if you believed that someone was out of policy because you've read all the policies, would you say that it's fair for that officer to continue to roam the streets, or should that officer, if personnel investigation be done, that officer be off the streets? Vaskin-Gordikian was actually a great example. I bring it up because they actually did take him off the streets, even though he was still getting paid at home for 2 years. But do you think it is a good idea for a police officer that is under investigation for having dangerous acts or being out of policy continue to roam our streets?
Well, I think all I can say about that is if I was aware of a violation of policy by any of our peace officers, I would report that to the chief and the city manager, and I would expect that it be handled appropriately. But, the facts matter. If we're talking about, uniform violations or something like that are out of policy, or if we're talking about illegal uses of force or substance abuse, there's a whole gamut of potential facts that your question's raising. And I think these investigative procedures exist for a reason, because, we, over many years and thousands of cases, we've come to the place that we think due process is important, and thoughtful, appropriate decision making is also important.
Okay.
And I get that we have some really bad history in this country, that we're unfortunately racism and other evil has hidden behind the kind of thing that I just said. But in Pasadena in 2021, I'm just not sure that we can do better than following the law, finding out all of the facts, and then making just, fair, appropriate, lawful decisions as best we can.
if you saw a police officer spit on a person while they were in restraints, would you think that that would be grounds to be reprimanded or potentially fired because that's very unprofessional?
I would report that to the chief and the city manager if I saw that.
So you do not think that that would be that's not egregious to you? Like if an officer just spit on someone that was in restraints?
It intentionally spit as a
yes, intentionally spit.
Disrespectful
yes.
act. I would report that because I would think it would be completely inappropriate and should be met with appropriate investigation and potential discipline. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, I will say this, that we had officers in Pasadena that suffocated someone while in restraints and actually spit on them while they were in the restraints. And all of those officers are still working for the Pasadena Police Department. So, I mean, I'm not trying to go on back and forth with you. I'm just saying that it sounds like you know what's right and what's wrong, and you know that this is not policies in Pasadena. I mean, maybe somewhere else, but in Pasadena, people are supposed to be treated with the utmost respect. Employees of the city should uphold to their policies. No one has the right, by the way, no one has the right to have a job here. It's not a right. So, I mean, if we wrongfully fire someone just for no random reason, just, oh, I didn't like you, you're chewing bubble gum today, or you're black, I don't like it. But if you're way out of policy, then we should be holding people accountable. And I see you as, you know, based on the things that you've brought up to the council over and over again, it's about accountability to you. We can't turn a blind eye to one department or a couple departments. We have to look at everybody as an equal employee. And there's policies, and we do not have to wait. And this is not for you. I'm just back again, and I'm going to keep on reiterating this. We should not have to wait for a criminal investigation to be complete for us to know if a person should be in our employ. I employ people all day. If they're out of policy, if they're late to work, okay, over and over and over again, I'm sorry. You do not have a right to have this job.
But
you go and talk.
I would, if I could, I would ask you to consider whether, you know, the state law around policing and the special rules and regulations that govern the way that we handle these matters makes this somewhat different from a situation where you or I might have an employee at will that we have complete unfettered discretion to fire for any reason or no reason, as long as it's not an impermissible reason, like the ones you cited, discrimination or what have you. I'm not sure that in the realm of public safety that that's true, and for good reason, because of the dangers of public safety and the importance that we place on having public safety officers that can protect us all.
I would say that that is actually the case in California. And you served on the airport commission as well. I've recently been appointed to the airport commission. I've had a couple conversations with the police chief there. Employees of the police department there, not for anything egregious, but just for policy violations, have actually been terminated. Chief, I'm so sorry. I just have one question before we go to public comment. And this is for the city manager or the police chief. How many officers within the past 5 years, actual sworn officers, have been terminated? For policy violations?
I've probably terminated, I'm not going to go into any details, obviously, but
I'm sorry, you
been a few this year. A handful this year.
A handful this year.
Less than a handful, I believe.
Terminations.
And these were actual sworn officers?
Yes. The ending to any one of those on whether I recommend termination or not doesn't end at that point. There are evidentiary hearings, there's arbitration, there's court cases that go through. So you're not done at just calling somebody out on termination is not the end of the process at all. It's usually just the beginning for years.
Thank you for that answer.
Take it a step further. So, in that, have those in those termination cases, Chief. I know you can't get into specifics, but have they all been through the appeal process internally with the city, or are they still, some of them still in the appeal process?
Again, I couldn't answer that because once you start answering that, people know who we're talking about, and it could be an issue.
Okay, well, you could tell us. I mean, you've been the chief. You've been with the department for a long time. How many do you even know the number? How many in the past 5 years? Actual sworn officers, not people that work for the police department. Sworn officers with badge and gun.
Less than 10.
Okay. Are we ready to turn to public comment?
Oh, I had one more. How many of them have been successfully? I mean, you fired or terminated them. Are they on unpaid leave? Are they? I mean, are they getting paid while they're still arbitrating, or are they not getting paid?
Really answer those questions.
Councilmember Hammond, I think generally speaking, when the chief terminates an employee, they're generally taken off the books. But then, if matters are pursued further, the employees have a right to do that through their MOU or perhaps salary resolution, and so they have a right to pursue that. But the chief really can't get into specifics beyond sort of statistically what you were asking.
All right. Well, he could tell me this though. Maybe there have been officers that have been terminated.
That's a procedural question, and the answer is a procedural question. No, you're right, Mr. Hampton. Your question is right. I mean, we're not procedurally, once the action is taken by the hiring authority, in this case the chief, then a person is taken off payroll. Correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But how many of them have been successfully terminated? That means that they're completely separated from the city.
I think that's where it kind of gets into confidentiality of the officer's personnel record.
Right. So the actual answer could be 0. Or the actual answer could be 2. Or the actual answer could be 1.
I know of one case that's in the public record that cost the city a lot of money because well,
that's only one case I know about.
Yeah, the court determined that I don't know if the previous chief's action was not appropriate, and we ended up paying quite a bit of money.
Generally, if you look at it nationally, there's some stats out there, and one of the ones by people is that 60 to 70% of all terminations or major suspensions get overturned. Major termination suspensions are overturned. National number. Because they have more litigation, more laws, more processes. That number could even be.
Event that a termination is overturned, Mr. City Attorney, then that employee is entitled to back pay and then also return to their duty, correct?
Generally speaking, if we were to go to arbitration, and if that were the result of the arbitration, that probably would be the award. But then in that sense, that would go to the manager for final decisions. The manager can accept or reject the arbitrator's findings. If the manager rejects that, the employee goes to court. Again, that's also perhaps the same remedy that might be ordered.
That's one of those situations where if somebody does research on a national level, you'll see how many police officers are returned back for major incidents that we've seen on television over the past 18 months on the news. How many of those the officers have actually been returned back to work or.
No, you went mute again, Chief. Sorry.
If you do research, council member, and for everybody else across the country over the last 18 months, many of the terminations that have occurred initially for officer-involved shootings. The most recent one I could think of that happened a few months ago was the Atlanta shooting. All the officers returned back to work or got settlements for that one, and for two of them out that way, in fact. And so across the country, when you do your research and you figure out the best routes to go, you know that the majority of these officers are returning back to work or getting settlements for not returning back to work after initial terminations.
By the courts.
By the courts, and then how the cities handle those are up to them in private.
So I mean, since it's been under 5, I mean, or under 10, we should know how many. I mean, I only know about one case where an officer was actually terminated from the city, completely separated from the city.
No, the one I'm referring to is the one that came, Mr. Hampton. The one I was referring to is the one that came back where we had actually two. I can think.
Well, we have to be careful because when we talk about terminating officers, they have the right to have employment in this country, and if we start to make them into the newspaper articles for what we think are the reasons, these officers will not find employment, and we'll see them suing us again. And so when they get terminated, they terminate, they leave, and that's the end of it. But they're trying to make them into a piñata to hit them with a stick for Kennedy to come out. I think we have to be really careful in this room as we start to want to bring names and officers up. They've been terminated, they're gone, and they have the right for employment somewhere else.
No, I'm referring to civil cases brought against the city by officers that were terminated that ended up costing the city millions of dollars because a court found that the investigation or the outcome was not appropriate, the penalty was not appropriate.
And that's fair. That's a new trend that's happening as well.
That's different.
The majority of cases are, in fact, finding violations with POBRs across the state. We're seeing that more often, more settlements, more reverses. So it's much more than just saying you're fired. It's much more than that. It's much deeper than that. But in fact, we are seeing arbitrations and issues in court with evidentiary rules and everything else that occurs. So very difficult place to be and try to navigate it after you terminate an individual. Much more to it than that.
So before we leave, I mean, because we just mentioned the termination, and it sounds like potentially maybe one or two that I know of have actually been completely separated because they had to be separated, and one I already mentioned. But I mean, it was kind of like a random number that was given over the past 5 years, and I would like to actually have an actual number of how many have actually been separated from the city within the past 5 years. I'm not asking for names. I actually don't even. I only know one of the names. Well, one of the names because it was all in the newspaper.
Yeah, I think data is appropriate to.
Yeah,
appropriate.
I mean, it's just a number. I mean, it's
Yeah.
either 1, 0, 2, whatever it is. I mean, it's actual. It's an actual number. How many terminations have turned into a full separation?
I think we should turn to public comment, but before we do that, I think there's a difference. We should keep in mind there's a difference between the city's action to discipline and terminate. That's one step in the process, and then it's completely different when during the appeal process, a court then overturns the decision of the police chief and the city. So it's a two-step process. There's the initial action, and I think it's fair to ask, well, how many has the city taken action on to terminate? I remember asking this very question over the years. How many complaints have we had? How many of those complaints have been investigated? How many resulted in discipline, including termination? And I've received numbers before. But that's a separate and distinct question than how many were not fully separated because a court overruled the police chief or the city. Two very different questions in my view, and two sets of data. Okay, let's turn to public comment.
First public comment is Jane from Jane Ward, followed by Kat Ross.
Hello, my name is Jane Ward. I'm representing Showing Up for Racial Justice. Gosh, first, since the officer who killed Anthony McLean is subject to tolling, the city can still take disciplinary action, so let's do it. If the city needs to direct Steve Mermel and risk a lawsuit, so be it. If we need to amend the charter to empower the council to discipline its employees and untie its hands when the police kill its residents, then maybe that's the next step. Like in Long Beach, this should have been handled by the city right away. Steve Mermel described that case as terrible and egregious. An officer fired into a car that was driving away. He described that mother with sympathy. But the Pasadena police fired into a body, the body of Anthony McLean, a body that was running away. Why isn't that egregious? Why wasn't that perceived to be terrible enough that the city felt confident to take action? Because like Councilmember Hampton said, it was Chief Perez and Steve Mermel's opinion that Anthony McLean's murder wasn't egregious enough. Anthony McLean's life didn't matter enough. As Hampton also said, you don't need a criminal investigation to fire an employee. Fire the employee who killed someone who was running for their life. Fire that employee. I also want to flag a dynamic that unfolded at this meeting. For an hour, we were told that this was a general meeting about officer-involved shooting procedures. So the council and the city manager were going to speak in vague generalities. But I'm grateful that it became clear that you know we're all here because we have a concrete case of involved shooting of a beloved community member who was shot while running for his life. But his life was not deemed valuable enough for this to rise to the level of egregiousness. You also know that when we talk about evidence, we need to talk about whose hands collected that evidence and what they do with it. Because anyone who's watched the video of Anthony McLean's shooting knows that it is far from being reliable evidence. It's more of a PR video for the Pasadena Police Department with voiceovers telling viewers what they want us to see and graphics that claim to spotlight a gun that no one can see and so forth. Speaking of the evidence, we need a policy in which the unedited, undoctored evidence is made available to the public and remains posted until the end of the investigation. The city needs a policy that makes an immediate investigation by an objective party, not by the police themselves, a mandatory procedure following shootings or other incidents.
And has expired. Pat Ross, followed by Hiram Cormier Jr.
Hi. The City Council should instruct the City Manager to create a policy for the immediate public release of unedited evidence within 24 hours of an incident of excessive force and keep up the evidence posted until the case is closed. The City Council should instruct the City Manager to create a policy for an immediate investigation by an objective party, not the police. It sounds like the current procedures, the investigators rely on other agencies, like the DA, to fully investigate. So decisions cannot be made for years. City Council should instruct the City Manager to create a policy wherein the Pasadena police investigators fully investigate so that disciplinary action can be made in a timely manner. Their own investigation should include interviewing witnesses, depositions, sworn statements, reviewing video and audio evidence, so that confident decisions can be made within 9 months. Officers do not want to work side by side with officers who act out of policy. It's odd that Pasadena wants to keep officers employed after killing or beating residents of Pasadena. Firing officers who kill or beat our residents keeps our residents safe. Councilmember Madison said police officers protect us all, but they did not protect Anthony McLean, and they certainly did not protect Chris Ballou. agendize the conduct of City Manager Steve Vermel and his delinquents in holding his employees accountable to a standard Pasadena residents deserve.
Ross, next speaker.
Hiram Cormier Jr.
Okay, welcome.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
You guys should be so ashamed of yourself. This shit wasn't so common. If I didn't see this so many times, I swear to God, I would have broke down crying. Something is wrong with you people. Every last one of you lack heart. All of you. I swear to God. First of all, fire the officers who killed Anthony McLean. How many times do we have to say it? How many times do we have to go through this? Last week, Gordo, you said that you want murderers held accountable. Well, I know some murderers for you. Their names are Edwin Duma-Gwendon, Ryan Mulrooney, Ronald Sereno, Connor G. Duncan, Christian Rosa, John Perez, Steve Mermel. If you're not willing to hold these people accountable, you're just as complicit. And that's a fact. The rest of you council members as well. Please fire them. As the two previous callers said, I'm demanding a policy for mandatory disciplinary action of your police misconduct. The police cannot investigate themselves. Law enforcement will always investigate law enforcement and find that law enforcement did nothing wrong. Change that. Put it in a non-subjective hand. Because if you had it your way, the cops are innocent as ever. Publish all video, written, and audio records of officer-involved shootings within 24 hours of the incident, and they must remain online until the investigation is fully complete. Otherwise, cops could just spin their narrative as they did in this case of Anthony McLean. You guys talk so much about policy, but you know, the thing that really blows my mind is that y'all feel like legal and right, legal and moral are the same thing. They are nowhere near the same. Please do not forget, the Holocaust was legal, slavery was legal, Jim Crow was completely legal, and in the same vein, police shootings and murder are completely legal. It will always be found in policy. And like Hampton said, you do not need to be a criminal to be terminated. Terminated. I'm going to tell you one thing. These people are dangerous. Personally. Someone I love, actually. The cop who shot Anthony McLean, Edwin Duma-Gwendon, tried to kill one of my family members a few days before he killed Anthony McLean. So when we say this could be us, we mean it quite fucking literally. Stop running. Do something, because this is not right. And you will pay for this. God sees everything. Trust me when I tell you that. You will not get away with this. Hate felt for so long, it's codified into policy. Hate felt for so long does not feel like hate. It just feels like policy. It just feels like I'm just doing my job. It feels like economics, religion, tradition, and culture. And you have a culture of beating the shit out of black people and killing us. Fact. Fuck y'all niggas. Fuck Perez, fuck Mermel, fuck all of you.
Mr. Cormier,
Point of order.
What's so disrespectful about me not wanting to see black people killed in the street?
Mr. Cormier, please.
What's so disrespectful?
Thank you.
Next public comment is Sarah Bolin, followed by Jasmine Richards Abdullah.
Thank you, Councilmember Hampton, for your perseverance in this issue and for also being the only source of urgency in this entire council. It is staggering to me that he is the only voice of urgency amongst all of you. It is unbelievable that Councilmember Madison believes that citizens are best served by fair and just conclusions when the citizens of Pasadena are afraid to leave their homes because there are murderous police officers on the streets. Beyond the Anthony McLean and Christopher Ballou who have been murdered, the living residents of Pasadena must live with those murderers being in the employ of the city. They are paying taxes for murderers to be overseeing them still. This is egregious. I don't know what more we need to show you to prove that this is egregious. We need mandatory disciplinary action for police officers. We need immediate release of body cam video. We are paying for this technology, and we are not seeing it work in our benefit in any way. I cede the rest of my time.
Jasmine Richards Abdullah, followed by Adriana Bautista.
All right. Yeah, this just concurred to everything that I already knew, which is that we need to amend the city charter and we need to look into the police bill of rights because that's what you guys keep hiding behind. To add to what Hampton's statement, the cases that he was referring to was Reginald J.R. Thomas and Anthony, and they were deemed gang members. So to you guys, it's apparent that their lives don't matter. Officer Villicana, which was the officer that spit on Reginald J.R. Thomas, is still on duty, and we see him all the time patrolling. Steve, why do you get to say what life is more valuable than others? What is egregious or not? There is sufficient assurance that Officer Dumagwendon murdered Anthony McClain while his back was turned and he was running away. There is sufficient. Mermel, you stated that the officer in Long Beach was shot. Mona, because we're going to use her name, Mona Rodriguez, in a car while driving away. Dumagwendon shot a person while running away. There's sufficient evidence that Anthony was not, he wasn't out of policy. I mean, Anthony was not trying to hurt or do nothing to nobody. He was trying to flee. To answer Hampton's questions, there was no witnesses that were questioned during the Anthony McClain murder. But in the Kendrick McDade murder, there were witnesses questioned when they thought that the witness had been robbed and they could deem Kendrick McDade a robber and an assailant. But then as soon as that concurred and they seen that that man was lying, what did they do? They deported him. So when it doesn't go towards your narrative, you guys don't listen. You guys are leaning more on the district attorney than you guys are doing an independent auditor. Now, we know that you guys don't listen to independent auditors because in the Kendrick McDade murder, there were 68 recommendations by the independent auditor, Henry Giannaco, and you guys didn't even take it. I think Perez Sanchez said that he would listen to 7 of them, and he implemented none of them. So we can see that your officers are steadily out of policy. You guys don't do anything. So what we're going to do is we need to amend the city charter, hire a full-time mayor and a full-time city council members so that they can be accountable to the city. Because right now, Mamel, we know that you're appointed, you're selected, and you don't have to listen to us. So what I'm asking everybody that's listening, all the viewers, what we need to do is come together with a petition to amend the city charter. And we need to go after Sacramento to amend the Police Bill of Rights. Because they're going to continue to hide behind all of this because they think we don't know what we're talking about, but we do. And we're going after you guys, and we're going to go after the city charter. So now we're going to start a petition. So all these groups that are listening, all of you guys, let's get together and amend the city charter so that we can hire a full-time mayor and a full-time city council, and that we can use our funds that are in the city to pay these people so that they are accountable to us, the city. And I took on the previous caller's time.
Next speaker is Adriana Bautista, followed by Heavenly Hughes.
Hello, Public Safety Committee. Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes. I can hear you.
Adriana, go ahead. We can hear you.
I am demanding that this be agendized in the city council because that is what you all told us you would do. It's been rerouted to the Public Safety Committee, but we need this back in city council because what was discussed today by the assistant city attorney is that city council actually does have some say in making in improving the personnel policy And I do not understand why a chief of police who has had no problems not using facts is sitting at the table preaching to us about facts and wanting aspects of a narrative report from the DA in order to make a decision. What about the independent investigation, which makes independent policy recommendations, none of which have even ever been used by PPD? How are we going to wait on someone whose interest is to protect his employees to tell us what the time frame should be? Mr. Perez has no problem keeping police employed who spit on, kick, suffocate, shoot, kill, brutalize unarmed Black men. Mr. Perez is more willing to blame the men for their own deaths. Everything he and Marmel stated today reflects much of the same. Disregard for Black life, disregard for the public safety of residents at the hands of PPD officers.
1 minute left.
And Mr. Madison says that we don't have all the facts before us. Well, who is sitting on the facts? And what policy is allowing this person to sit on the facts? This needs to go to city council because, as you've seen, you were successful in rerouting it to public safety by not getting as many public commenters and not as many people listening in today. So if that's what your intention was, hey, good job. Pasadenans have seen enough of the facts. We saw PPD kill a man who was fleeing a discriminatory traffic stop in the back. Additional officers handcuffed and detained him face down to bleed out and die. No visible gun was on the victim or near the victim in any of the footage released. And again, Chief Perez has had the power to control what footage was released and what was not. So we demand that you release all of the footage. And we saw that the officer who shot Anthony McClain, his body camera was on.
Adriana, if you'll wrap up your comments, please.
Okay, it's over. My comments finished.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Heavenly Hughes, followed by Alan Shea.
Thank you. Heavenly?
Can you hear me, Mayor Victor Gordo and Pasadena City Council?
We can hear you.
Or the Public Safety Committee?
We can hear you.
Epic fail. Epic fail. Was this what you call helping the community understand? Y'all didn't even understand. All I heard was too many words happening. And my peaceful Black behind could not even I was disgusted with hearing all the cleanup you all tried to imply after y'all put your foot in your mouth. Y'all have been shucking and jiving, lying and cheating the whole time, playing duck, duck, goose. It's on you. Overlapping and passing the buck. Y'all really have put your foot in your mouth tonight. Chief Perez and Steve Mermel let us know that they have discretionary privilege to take disciplinary action when they see a egregious behavior of a police officer. Now we see why the Pasadena police is getting away with murdering and violently beating Black men and Black children and Black people in Pasadena. Police Chief John Perez and Steve Mermel are the frontline leadership to administer discipline and personnel investigation for employees of the city. Mayor Victor Gordo, they made it real clear. You and the city council can, actually it's your duty to suggest and instruct Steve Mermel to take action. Let's start there. Take action for disciplinary action, for disciplinary officer-involved shooting. I'm going to go further to say, the public safety and policy and procedure of the police department is to guide decisions for acceptable and unacceptable behavior. Not to only have a policy, which y'all don't have, obviously, in writing, but to reinforce it, to do something by the frontline leadership. You guys are our frontline leadership. Frontline supervisors such as Stephen Mel and Chief Perez, Mayor Victor Gordo, and City Council are largely responsible for the effect and the culture of policing in our Black and brown neighborhoods. But instead, we see the code of silence being used to cover up in of the murder of Anthony McClain. I saw you all in this meeting today going back and forth and back and forth. And still, I still haven't heard, what are you guys going to do? What's your action? What's your policy? When are you guys going to agendize that? I agree with Tyrone Hampton when he used the word hell. What the hell is going on? I'm sorry?
Ms. Hughes, your time is up. If you'll wrap your comment up, please.
Today we demand the following. All raw footage collected by the PPD or city be made immediately available within 72 hours or less after officer-involved shooting. I want to echo everything that I've heard so far from every caller. I hope this time you guys can actually listen to the community. It's not about whatever y'all want to do. It's about what the community wants to do.
Thank you, Heavenly.
Thank you, Mayor Victor Gordo.
Here is Ellen Shea, followed by Karina Kay.
Good afternoon, the Honorable Mayor Gordo and the Committee, Public Safety Committee. You know, I am so rattled by a fickled presentation of what you're supposed to represent as leaders here in Pasadena with tonight's display to the community. Obviously, if you have the power and the discretion to fire and to do some things that will resolve it, you should do it. I'm going to direct this clearly to you, John Perez. You released the tape of Anthony McClain, specifically, well, let me finish, Steve, because it's going to bounce back to you too, to make you aware that Anthony McClain's shooting was idle.
Alan, if you can just direct your comments generally to the body, but we understand.
Thank you. All right. Well, I'll direct it to the body. 7 days after Anthony was shot, the videos were released. I made contact with the body, how critical that shooting was, and that there was no gun in his possession. Each frame was broken down to identify this so we can move forward to preserve the city, Mayor Gordo. I made sure it sent emails out to everyone of that effect. So we will not be going through this torturous experience that we're going through. Over a year later, we're still looking at lies. We're looking at corruption. Everything that was said tonight that was said by the officer in Atlanta. There was only one officer in Atlanta that got his job reinstated. And the only reason he got his job reinstated was because of their oversight committee that
1 minute left.
was totally political. It was one. But yet someone said it was two to make it sound like he got his job back. No, that doesn't have to happen in Pasadena. Clearly, in the Nicholas Bill case in San Diego, that officer was fired within days after he shot Nicholas Bill in the back, arrested for second-degree murder, and with a bail of $500,000. These things are out here. All of this who's on first, who's on second stuff is just not going to work until we see real leadership. And we're not seeing that. That's why we keep going back to giving us clarity as the community here in Pasadena. And I truly hope the committee is listening. It's not going to stop. It's going to get worse. Clean it up. Mayor Gordo, clean this mess up. They're guilty. There's corruption. There's all these things here. There was a gun. There was a gun.
If you can wrap up your comments, Mr. Shea.
I will wrap up my comment. There was a gun in the crime scene that was brought in 2 minutes after Anthony was shot. We have video of that fact. that a gun was brought in on the east side of the street.
Mr. Shea, Alan, if you'll please wrap up your comments.
All I'm asking is that you, Mayor Gordo, clean this mess up. We cannot rely on John Perez. We cannot rely on the city manager at this point. We need your leadership. Thank you.
Is Karina Kay, followed by Georgia Sanders.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you so much. My name is Karina. I am a resident of Pasadena, and I'm also speaking on behalf of Black Lives Matter Los Angeles. And I want to start my comment off by saying the name Anthony McClain. He is someone who was robbed of due process. We've spoken and we've heard a lot about due process for the officers and all of the legalities around due process for the officers. But Anthony McClain wasn't given due process. He was entitled to due process, but he didn't get it. And so what we have sat here and listened to is basically what has caused us to be in this position in the first place. We have seen that your administrative process will simply align with POVAR, will simply align with the criminal investigation, and not allow for any immediate action on behalf of the city for any killer cop to be taking off of our streets. We have to endure that. We have to endure police officers, killer cops being on the street. And we can assume now that we have the information, we can assume that no action will be taken on the part of the city of Pasadena. Not from the police chief, not from the city manager, not from the council members, not from the city attorney. The police chief, the police department themselves said that we don't investigate immediately when a shooting happens. We're talking about officer-involved shootings, right? We don't investigate right away, We don't investigate the night of. We might take our time. And shootings don't happen always at night either. So they happen in the daytime. The city of Pasadena needs to have urgency when police officers shoot on the job. There is no concern for human life here at all. This is why we're in this position, and we are going to remain in this position. You are policymakers, you are decision makers, and you have not implemented and discussed any new policy for urgency or for immediacy when it comes to human life being stolen. Anthony McClain's life matters. We need mandatory disciplinary action for officers. Mandatory, not let's defer to the legal processes that are already here. You said that the city of Pasadena is a chartered city. So you as policymakers have the ability, have the discretion to implement a policy, as Councilmember Tyrone Hampton said. That's why we called this meeting. And instead you defaulted to what's already here. You did nothing, and that's why we're here. A man was murdered, and it doesn't make any fucking sense that when an officer has the potential to be looked at for criminal activity, we're gonna keep them on the streets. It wasn't chewing fucking bubblegum. When an officer is up for criminal activity, something severe, like taking a life, for example, something severe, let's keep them on the force. What fucking sense does that make? That doesn't make any fucking sense. We demand that those officers be fucking fired immediately, and whatever consequences come out of that afterwards will be the motherfucking consequences. You got killer cops on the motherfucking street. I don't want to be pulling up to a stop sign and see a fucking killer cop next to me. That's not public safety. This is a public safety committee meeting, and you have not discussed public safety at all.
If you'll wrap up your comments.
All of y'all should be ashamed. Do right, or we're still in the same fucking position.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Monica Watts.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Ms. Watts, we can hear you.
Yeah, my name is Monica Watts. I live on Holly Street. I want to say this is my first time in a while listening to a city council meeting, and I just am in disbelief that you all abdicated your responsibility all this time to the people you hired, the city manager and the chief of police, to handle such a matter. It's not too often that I hear things as an advocate, a national advocate, that sound exactly like what you would hear in the South or in the heart of the Midwest, where at least they would lay off people that do such things. But you all have abdicated your responsibility and are in this meeting so subdued to not be able to make a comment, to be able to not even ask questions. Clearly, this needs to be a full meeting. I'm not sure why you're getting away with having Zoom meetings when you've opened up nightclubs, businesses, and everyone else to open meetings with social distancing and masking, but that's another disgrace for our city. Now, the city spent millions of dollars fighting desegregation of the public schools in this area. I've lived here for over 27 years and have fought many issues. And this looks like just one more. But I'm going to tell you right now, I will stay involved. I will pay attention. And you all need to start understanding that when you look worse in the South and the Midwest in terms of what you're doing to Black bodies, it's a disgrace. And everyone is watching, and they will be watching. And I don't understand for the life of me why the city councilman is using all this wordsmithing, the way attorneys do with words, to the point where you don't even understand what he's saying. It's disgusting. You should stop it. You know you're talking to the public. Say what you mean and do what you say.
1 minute
And an
left.
amendment to the charter is obviously required, amendment to the charter, and the police unions should not rule the country. Thank you very much.
That concludes public comment.
Okay, colleagues, that concludes public comment. Questions, comments from any member of the committee? Hampton?
I didn't know if Councilmember Kennedy or Councilmember Madison had any comments.
First in the queue.
Okay, I'm just going to be very brief. I did ask for this to come to the full city council. I know you asked, Mayor said, you'd like to, tee this off with public safety. I think this is a conversation that needs to go to the full city council to decide if they want to move forward with the policy that directs our staff to finish personnel investigations in a timely fashion and not wait and not contingent upon a criminal investigation. All of the speakers were right on. I mean, we are continuing. Once again, it went from the DA's hand, and now it's in the city manager's hand, and it's never our issue. When we put up policies and tell our city employees, I think it's really interesting that we put policies together to tell our city employees what they should be doing or what they should be focusing on their actually scope of work. I find it interesting that we could tell them what their scope of work should be, but we cannot put a policy together to say, hey, if you're outside of your policies, the policies that we put together, by the way, then someone should, make sure that there's the proper termination in some cases. In this case, I mean, I agree with the speakers. I've never held my tongue on that. That there are officers that should be fired. There are city employees that should be fired. But if we constantly let them stay and continue to let them stay, it gets worse. It gets worse. It gets worse. And maybe it doesn't matter because, and I've said this before, maybe you guys don't think about this because they're black men and black women getting abused, and maybe that's the problem. It doesn't bother anybody because they're just black people. Let me tell you this: we're all human beings. No matter the skin tone, I should be treated exactly the same as the next individual. We live in Pasadena, one of the cities with the most diversity. My neighborhood is extremely diverse. Are you telling me that my next door neighbor, because he's Caucasian or Asian across the street, is going to get better treatment for me from city services? We cannot continue to discard a portion of our city or any individual, period. We put on policies about anti-hate, potentially a reproduction policy. We put up things because we want people to know, even raising flags at the city for inclusivity with LGBT rights, etc. We're willing to do all those things because they look good and it's all political. But when a group of African American men and women are slain and beat by the police, we can't even say, hey, is this person within the policy? Is this person within policy to continue to be in the employ of the city of Pasadena? It's not egregious enough that Reginald Thomas was beat to death, suffocated, and then spat on. That's not egregious. I'm going to continue this. This is a policy decision that no matter what, we have to take to the full city council to have this discussion. Things have to change. We are living a new day. This is not the 80s anymore. And Pasadena is not this place where, I mean, it's a utopia in my mind. I love Pasadena. I still love Pasadena, right? But let's not act as if national issues are not happening at Pasadena's doorstep, because this is where these conversations go. These conversations go, oh, we can't do this, we can't do that, it's policy. Oh, this nationally, oh, you know, what happened in Atlanta, what happened in Texas, what happened in D.C. or Maryland, it's not the same thing that's happening in Pasadena. No, it's the same exact thing. And we are constant, and the council as a whole is letting people get away with it. Accountability is key for everything. If you want public trust, you have to hold people accountable. You know what? We will have each and every one of our policies, each and every one of our contracts questioned over and over and over when it comes to policing, fire, or any department, because we're not able to hold people accountable. I mean, people are questioning everything. I mean, just the other day, 10 public speakers on barricades to protect people's lives for anti-terrorism, because they don't trust the system, and that goes back to us. They don't trust us. And I'm putting myself in that because I'm part of this body. Even though I'm the one person who may be saying something, I'm still part of this body. I may be an arm or a hand, but we're all still part of this body, and we have a city as a whole. No matter where these things happen or where they occur, the city as a whole, it is our duty to respect and treat each and every life with dignity. Each and every life with dignity. Very simple. No one's asking for any preferential treatment. I'm not asking for you every time a black person comes into somewhere to roll out some red carpet. I'm just asking for you to finish an investigation to see if these officers should be allowed to be on the streets. I'm just asking you to finish an investigation to see if a trash truck driver or any other employee should still be an employee of the city because of improper treatment of any citizen. That's my comment, Mayor.
Thank you.
I'm still asking for this to come to the full city council. So I mean, it doesn't need a vote of the committee, because we've seen that happen before, where things just move to the full city council anyways without a vote. So I still would like this to come to the full city council so we can have this discussion.
Mr. Kennedy?
Mayor, I just want to confirm that we will place on the city's website after this discussion a way in which to keep the community better informed, that the community actually knows what the policies are. And timelines related to investigations. And so the community would be better informed on what the policies are and be able to share specifically what they would like to change or like to see change in the policies. I think the community has raised a number of serious issues. The only way to deal with them, as you know, is for the council in many instances to take an action or there to be a charter amendment. So if we can get that information up in a clear way, one of the speakers talked about lack of clarity. So I think if we take that step, which is not a step that is to ameliorate or to tell the world that we've done it all, we just need to give the community the facts. That would be helpful. Then the community could know what modifications they'd like to see one way or the other. Is that something that you plan to do?
Councilmember Kennedy, following up on that suggestion, it is something that I plan to pursue in terms of making sure that we have available information on the website that explains the officer-involved shooting investigatory process. So we'll follow through on that.
And incumbent with that is just the state of the law, Javon, as it exists today. That would give a concerned community information that is helpful in articulating what they believe needs to change.
We can see how that might be feasible to coordinate with city manager for police department website.
Thank you very much to both of you.
Thank you, Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Madison?
I have no more comments, Mayor. Thank you very much for a very productive meeting.
Thank you. So I do think that the data request that has been made, general data, and we shouldn't limit it to one department, but all departments would be important. I recall when we had this discussion numerous times, but I do recall under previous chiefs, both Chief Malikian as well as Chief Sanchez having general data shared with the public and members of the city council. You know, how many complaints, for example, are initiated against city employees or I think we should say that.
We do that on the chief's report every month. So I review how many complaints, how many uses of force. I think when they did it was quarterly or yearly. We do it on a monthly basis with the chief's report and trying to put up. And we issue it out on a report to the public as well.
I think what Mr. Hampton and members of the public are asking for, and you know, I think it's a fair request. Of those complaints, how many are still in the investigatory process? How many have been fully investigated? And how many resulted in some level of discipline? And of the ones that resulted in you exercising your discretion, or any chief exercising his or her discretion, how many resulted in the ultimate penalty or penultimate penalty of termination, and of those, how many healed outside of the city process and were ordered back by the courts or by the courts.
And that would work. I'll turn to the city attorney's office to work with in a format that's both from our end. We'll put out as much information as we can and all that, but at the other side of it, making sure it meets the legal platform. We could create something for everybody.
And Mayor, as the chief indicates, the police department's been regularly reporting out number of complaints received, what the disposition of the complaints are, and so we can take a look at what our reporting has been, which has been augmented with some additional.
Yeah, creating an end-of-year report would be good for this year, and then seeing what we have.
So I think it's important, especially as we move through to the commission for that data to be available. I mean, I think, you know, what we're looking for, as Mr. Hampton says, is trust in the community and through across all sectors. And, you know, that means being transparent. And I don't think Chief, you or anyone else disagrees with that.
Not all. The law will get in the way sometimes with what is viewed as trust.
Well,
that's very difficult.
Yeah, but having that data available, I think, gets us one step further.
Absolutely.
So that people can see, and frankly, so that we as the elected representatives can see that the city's process is working, that complaints are taken, that complaints are investigated, and where appropriate that there is the discipline appropriate, and that the discipline is issued.
Absolutely. We look at the legal parameters of that.
I think that's consistent with what other jurisdictions do in terms of reporting out data.
I think it's certainly reasonable, and like the chief said, it's been expressed in different timing and different forms in the past. But I think you know, we can see how that can be perhaps refreshed and presented a little differently for the council.
Absolutely. Maybe just its own PowerPoint every quarter that we could put out and it gets reviewed. I think we'll be limited on putting out the exact amount of the time off for people, who it is, but we'll find something.
Okay. This is an ongoing conversation, and you know, I'm certain this isn't the last time that this issue will be raised, and you know, it's appropriate to either inform directly public discourse through the city's police chief, the city manager, and members of the council an opportunity to weigh in. You know, and as it was Ms. Richards, Jasmine stated, you know, there are state statutes and that are out of our control, and if people have suggestions for changing of those state statutes, that's a state legislative issue, and ultimately the governor. We don't control state statutes. There are Pasadena want to amend their charter. The Pasadena it takes a vote of the people to do that, and so all options be on the table for all of the public to understand both what it takes and the implications behind for the decisions to change. So with that, I think our agenda, but I see the fire chief is still here. What's the will of the committee?
We've lost Councilmember Kennedy. He had to leave. Given the lateness of the hour, I did tell the fire chief he didn't need to stay, but I think he was intrigued by I would suggest that the second item off for the next meeting. Have a full committee.
I think we lost the full committee. Okay,
so I'm fine with that. And so, Mayor, just last question: when will this be coming to the full city council? Because that was a request originally.
Yeah, I got your request. I'll connect with you and city manager and the city attorney.
Okay, thank you.
The data is important. Okay. All right,
everybody. Thank you.
Mayor, before we go, when is our next meeting?
Next meeting is scheduled